Hi, I'd like to welcome you all to the CPT Education Team's Ask an Expert webinar, Strong and MBTI Career Counseling Strategies for Adult Clients. This is an advanced topic. We have actually more than 600 people registered today, which is very exciting. My name is Karen Gonzalez, and I'm the Associate Marketing Manager here at CPT. I'll be moderating today's webinar, and we'll be introducing our featured speaker, Judith Grutter, in just a moment. But before I do, I'd like to do a quick walkthrough of the webinar format for those of you who may be joining us for the first time. Today's webinar will run for approximately 90 minutes. During the presentation, if you have any questions, you're welcome to submit them to me using the question function in the webinar controls, or simply send me a chat message. Judy will be pausing throughout the webinar today to answer your questions, and I'll give everyone a chance to pose their questions during these breaks. As with all our webinars, today's webinar is being recorded, and we'll be sending out a link to the recording in just a few days. Now that I've walked you through the logistics, I'd like to introduce our expert. I'm very excited to welcome the CPT's Ask an Expert, Judith Grutter, GS Principal and Trainer. Judy has been a career development program consultant and trainer for more than 35 years, as well as a National Certified Counselor and NCDA Master Career Counselor. She is a recognized authority on the uses of assessments in career counseling and is co-author of a number of publications and reports on the Strong Interest Inventory, such as the new I Start Strong report and Myers-Briggs tools. Judy is also the author of the GS MBTI certification program for career counselors and educators and co-author of the GS Strong Interest Inventory certification program. Please join me in welcoming Judy, and now I'd like to turn over the webinar to her. Welcome, Judy.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Karen. I'm hoping everyone can hear me okay, and just send a message if there are any problems. I'm really excited to be able to do an MBTI and Strong webinar that goes a little bit beyond the basics. This particular topic originated in a workshop that I did in Lake Tahoe last April. It was an advanced workshop that generated a lot of discussion and thought. If you're new to these assessments, welcome. And if you're an experienced practitioner, we hope that the topic will reinforce what you already know and suggest some new strategies for working with adults. I guess before we start talking about career counseling for adult clients, we should probably have some agreement around the definition of adult. An adult could be almost anyone. But for this program, I'd like to make a distinction between traditional age college students and new graduates and who we're talking about here. Although most of the strategies that we'll be talking about could be used with young and inexperienced clients as well, the focus today with adults is typically more developmental than finding the best fit between assessment results and career fields. And for this program, for the definition of adult, I have in mind about 35 years old or older with some career-related work experience. The career concerns of adults don't always fit into the career exploration framework that we rely on for younger clients. The framework that most of us are used to begins with assessment of the client, identifies options, tests possibilities, and hopefully leads to the first steps toward career commitment. Career counseling with adults tends to be much broader than assessing, exploring options, and deciding. Those of you who have worked with me before know that I happen to believe that any career counseling is much broader than assessing, exploring, and deciding, but particularly when we're working with adults who have experience behind them. With adult clients, we're likely to be focusing on a career stage farther down the life path than career exploration and entry. And we're going to look at a couple of clients today that represent two different stages in career development. One kind of at the end of the career, the very mature adult, and one in middle adulthood. Sometimes adults are going to college for the first time or entering the professional workforce for the first time, and they are at the exploration point in career stage theory. But it's more likely that they're considering career enrichment or career advancement or career transition or career disengagement. Or they may be experiencing work adjustment problems, role adjustment, management style conflicts, getting along with colleagues, team participation, almost anything that creates enough doubt or stress to bring them to a career professional. It's the job of the career practitioner to isolate the core career concerns that bring adult clients to us. And we'll look at two clients today. The first one is where the pieces seem to come together pretty clearly around career transition, and the other where the career issues aren't as clear-cut. The approach with each of them is quite different, although the steps are pretty much the same. Every client is different, that we know, but I always follow these steps in one way or another. Sometimes they're blended all together, but the steps are still covered. First of all, I do a pretty thorough first session, what I call intake. If you're only meeting with a client once or twice, then sometimes some written work ahead of time will give you the information that I try to get during the intake. After the intake, usually at the end of a first session, with adults it usually takes more than one session, I develop a contract with clients. Contracting is very important. It outlines what we're going to be doing together and what they can expect. If appropriate, I arrange for Strong and MBTI testing. I almost always use the MBTI, and I use the Strong if career exploration or transition seem to be the issues. Type verification tends to clarify what's going on behind the scenes, and then we pull the pieces out of the Strong that relate to what has been discussed up to that point. Then we identify some options to explore and plan the next steps. First, we're going to briefly look at a pretty straightforward career transition client where we were able to fit the pieces together in just a few sessions. The client that we'll look at after him is a little more complicated and actually took longer than 3 or 4 sessions. This is Al. Many of you have already met Al in one or more of my training programs. He's my very favorite adult success story. And you can tell from his picture that he isn't a youngster. He made me promise I wouldn't tell you how old he was. When he requested career counseling, the only thing he could really say was that he was getting closer and closer to retirement, that he had never really loved his work, and wondered if people ever found their passion when they were older. His career has been in various phases of engineering, everything from production work to starting and running a successful business with over 100 employees. When he started college years ago, he intended to be a high school math teacher and did a dual major in engineering just to be safe. Teaching jobs were scarce then, and he wound up in automotive engineering, got married, had a family, and stayed in engineering. He completed a secondary teaching credential when he was in his 20s, but never got back to the classroom. Now his business is slowing down, and he wonders if maybe this is the time to think about teaching again. On the surface, it might look like the pieces don't exactly fit between the MBTI and his Strong results, and they didn't. He identified with his RIC themes, that's realistic, investigative, conventional themes from the Strong, but he really resonated with ENFP. We're going to talk a little bit about what happens when those two don't overlap like you would expect them to. And after giving him the Strong and the MBTI, we generated a Strong and MBTI career report, which really made him laugh. These were his top job titles. Now, when the pieces don't fit on paper, we have to shift to a little more intuitive approach, what I call the 4 W's. I'm going to go through them with you. To combine type and the Strong this way, we're pulling information out of some booklets, out of Introduction to Type in Organizations, and Where Do I Go Next? Where Do I Go Next is the Strong interpretive booklet, and we also use various reports. For Al, I was using the MBTI interpretive report. I had the ENFP career report, and I was using a Strong profile and then the combined report. Now we look at these 4 questions this way, the 4 W's. First comes, who am I? To help the adult client answer the question, who am I, we refer to some descriptors of the MBTI functions. The functions are the middle 2 letters of type, and the general occupational themes, the RIASEC themes. The second question is, why do I want to work? In fact, it's why is work important in my life? It's who am I and what role does work play in representing who I am? And for that, we look again at the MBTI, middle two letters, the functions, and the motivators for the RIASEC themes. Those motivators are in the combined report. They're also in Where Do I Go Next, the RIASEC interpretive booklet. To answer the third W, what do I want to do, we again look at the MBTI functions and the strong basic interest scales and the occupational scales. Finally, where do I want to do it? And again, we look at the MBTI middle two letters. You can probably see that with adults we're paying a lot of attention to those middle two letters. And then we also look at the RIASEC code again, either the RIASEC code from the general occupational themes or from a composite of the scales for the occupations. I'm going to show you how Al actually answered these 4 questions using these resources. These are the ENFP descriptors that Al identified with. I suspect there are a few of you out there that can identify with these as well. From his work experience and listening to Al describe what he had done, I knew that he had also developed a lot of sensing and a lot of thinking. From the Where Do I Go Next booklet, he also addressed the Who Am I question. We had a little trouble figuring out whether his theme code on the Strong was RIC or IRC. The motivators are slightly different. But these are how the words that he picked out to describe the themes for him. Thoughtful, analytical, independent, self-motivated, curious, problem-focused, and insightful. This you can see describes investigative. He also chose words from the realistic theme: reliable, adventurous, reserved, physically strong, hands-on, self-reliant, etc. Now he's not using all the descriptors. He actually went through Where Do I Go Next and picked out the words that he felt he could really identify with. And then from conventional, he also chose a few: conscientious, systematic, careful, dependable, efficient, and respectful. If you know type and you know ENFP, you can probably tell that these descriptors don't exactly fit with ENFP. These are the descriptors that describe his interests, whereas the ENFP descriptors describe his core personality. Once we had addressed the Who Am I question, we moved to the Why question. Why do I want to work? This is actually a mission statement, and I'm going to show you how Al put his together. I consider the mission statement the central core of career counseling with adults. Also true with 17, 18, 19, 20-year-olds, although it's harder for them to get to a core mission statement quickly. Al was able to do it using the resources that we provided. I feel that clients really have to be able to state this before any exploration of occupations and career fields can happen. And the statements that he has put together come right out of the published materials. He didn't make them up. First, he identified with to make a meaningful difference in people's lives. You can see that in the NF. And to use hands-on skills, that's the realistic. To probe questions of intellectual curiosity, that's the investigative. To summarize, this is how he stated the reason that he wanted to work, the purpose of work in his life. I want to use hands-on skills to probe questions of intellectual curiosity that make a difference in people's lives. Notice that intellectual is in parentheses. That was still a question mark. He didn't want to get rid of it, but he wasn't sure. The important thing for him was making a difference in people's lives, which is very true of the ENFP. He said when we were talking about this that he really hadn't explored that since back in his 20s when he was doing the credential to possibly go into teaching. We've looked at the personal stuff, the who am I, the why do I want to work. The MBTI plays a really big role here. Now we're going to look at more of the external, the concrete. What do I want to do? And I'm I'm absolutely convinced that we can't help clients of any age at any stage in their careers to answer the questions, what do I want to do, if they haven't first explored in some measure the who and the why pieces. The strong basic interest scales that were highest for him describe very specific interest areas, things that Al knows about and things that Al knows that he likes. From the MBTI career report, we have some task statements. These are very specific task statements that are appealing to the type. Both address the what do I want to do pieces of career exploration. Now the strong bizes are things that Al knows about. They could be career related or they could be activated in other parts of his life. The MBTI career report task statements are what his ENFP personality is naturally drawn to. And we also looked at work environment descriptors. These are from the ENFP career report. And these are the descriptors of work environment that he picked out that he wants to work in. I'm going to look at some work environment descriptors from the strong on the next slide, and then we're going to pause for some questions because some of you may have some questions about Al or just about this 4Ws process. From the strong basic interest scales, Al also came up with specific suggestions about where he might want to work. Now, he looked at teaching in his field of engineering. He also looked at training and development. He had been active in the American Society of Mechanical Engineers for years, and not unusual for ENFP types, had hundreds of contacts for networking. He eventually accepted a position with ASME. He actually developed the position through his networking. And he wound up working with high school teachers and high school to college bridge programs to recruit underrepresented students into engineering fields. And he loves it. He loves it. In his 60s, he's finding something that really embodies the ENFP passion. Now, after we have a little bit of discussion, we're going to look at a completely different kind of adult client. And I'll use her story to describe the steps we use when working with adults a little bit more thoroughly. But first, let's stop for any questions or discussions about Al or about the 4Ws process that you just saw. And I think Karen has been collecting questions.
Yes, and actually we have one question right now from Tamison. She's asking, how did Al score on social on the strong?
He didn't. He didn't. That's what's really interesting, is that on the MBTI, the ENFP was there clearly, and you would expect NF to correlate with social, and it didn't come up. Didn't come up. And we're going to be looking at that a little bit more with the next client, because what the MBTI does, and I'm going to reinforce this later, is it suggests who we were meant to be. If we know our type, if we own who we are, the MBTI is the genetic imprint, who we are meant to be. Whereas the strong picks up on what we've become, what we've been exposed to. So we've got this ENFP who spent his whole life in RIC stuff. So when we gave him the strong in his early 60s, of course the strong picked up on what he had become. And social, I believe, I'm sorry, I don't have the profile here, but it was definitely not even moderate. Teaching was there, though.
Great.
Good question.
Thank you. Thanks, Judy. I have another question from Deborah. She asks, you mentioned when you would or would not use strong with adults. Can you please elaborate a little more on that?
Yeah, this is a hard one because I think I rely on my own intuition to know when it's going to be appropriate and when it isn't. You have to kind of figure out what the issues are with the adult client, and that's why that first session is so critical. If a person has a pretty good sense of what their interests are and what field they want to stay in, then I'm not likely to use the strong. more often with adults, though, it's, as you're going to see with the next client, it's something revolving around the MBTI that's the issue. And usually we can take interests and generalize to and transfer to related career fields just from talking. I've found often, and I love the Strong. I mean, those of you who know me know that the Strong is my baby. There's nothing I love more than the Strong. But sometimes with clients, especially in their 50s and 60s, they see those job titles and career fields, as you're going to see with the next client, and they just go, I've done that. I don't want to do that anymore. I came to you because I want other ideas. And so you kind of have to figure that out. Again, it's the questions from those 4 W's that you're going to focus on. If they need to focus on the who am I and the why is life and work important, then it's the MBTI. If they're looking at the what exactly do I want to do and where do I want to do it, that's more likely to come from the Strong. And if they haven't answered those first 2, you're going to go back to the MBTI. I wish I could give you a very sensing, use the Strong in this case and use the MBTI in this case. I can't. It depends.
Okay, and I have another question that came in from Michelle. Michelle is asking, are the preferred work environment and career report similar to what is indicated in the introduction to type and or intro to type in organizations? And she also added a follow-up, which if one does not or cannot use a career report.
Well, if you can't use the career report, Introduction to Type and Careers would be the backup booklet that you could refer to and have on hand to use. And the preferred work tasks are similar to the ones that are in Introduction to Type and Organizations, definitely. They're not duplicates because the preferred work tasks are geared to the career counseling environment in the career report, whereas Introduction to Type and Organizations is a general publication for everyone. But yes, there's overlap, definitely. I love that resource. I use it all the time.
Great. Another question from John. John is asking, with older adults, I find that the values piece is extremely important to the process. How are you addressing values in this process?
Good question, John. And I think the values piece is important anywhere. Every single career development theory says that ultimate career choice is determined by values. So getting at values is critical. I get at values through the middle 2 letters of type. It's part of the discussion of verifying for Al the NF. With him, we didn't use a values assessment. When I do use because we didn't need to, the NF was just jumping off the page, and NF values are clearly expressed and also outlined in the various Introduction to Type publications. But when I do use a values assessment, I tend to use a card sort, or I'm a big fan of an instrument called the Kerwin Values Survey. I want to use an instrument that forces people to prioritize values, and card sorts do that, and the Kerwin does as well. Good question. I'm glad that values are popping to the surface.
Great. Another question is from Kate. Kate asks, how did you identify work environments from the BIS for Al, in parentheses, professional association, research institute, environment organization, etc.?
Good. They're listed in Where Do I Go Next? Where Do I Go Next is that little interpretive booklet for the Strong, and there's a page for each general occupational theme, and then the adjoining page has the basic interest scales for each theme, and suggested work environments is one of the categories, and he just picked them off the page. Everything that you saw on these slides, he picked off pages.
Great. Let's see here. I have another question from Gary. Gary is asking, would the why statement exercise work with 18 to 22-year-olds?
Yes. In fact, a couple of years ago, Catherine Raines and I were doing some workshops on college campuses, and we devised a system for actually putting together the mission statement that you saw on this slide, where you take a statement of meaning from the MBTI and a statement of meaning from the Strong, and you put them together. And and I've used it with high school students. I do a summer program for high school students in a leadership camp for the American Management Association, and we spend a whole day doing that through various activities. And when they go to their Strong and the MBTI, they can reach a mission statement, at least a mission statement to start from, in minutes. Whereas if you're not picking words off of resources, it can take a long time and a lot of self-exploration. I encourage it for high school and college students, especially if we're doing career exploration classes where we have a semester to work things through, definitely.
We have several questions coming in. Let's see here. We have another from Linda. Linda is asking, would you say that Al, at the time of taking the assessments, had a very distinct career identity and also a personal identity that were not necessarily merged, and that is why his results were seemingly disparate?
Yes. Does that make you happy, Karen? I gave you a one-word answer. Yes.
Awesome.
And actually, the way that showed up was that his IRC on the MBTI was on the Strong was fairly clear, and his NF was blurry on the MBTI. It took a while for him to own that ENFP. It doesn't go with engineering.
Okay. And Linda actually had another question. She says, regarding strong limitations, I also find that strong occupations don't necessarily resonate with experienced professionals because they are so broadly defined. Do you find this?
Yeah, it's interesting. The occupational titles on the Strong were never meant to be taken per se. Looking at one occupational title on the Strong is not what it's about. The occupations on the Strong serve as a gateway to the coding system, the reset coding system of occupations. And what the researchers have to do is come up with 120 to 130 job titles that broadly represent the job market and that represent the 6 corners of the hexagon, and that also represent the core characteristics of workers in broad fields of occupations. It takes a lot of work and a lot of money and a lot of energy to norm an occupational scale on the Strong. It's what sets this instrument apart from every other career assessment. And so they have to pick fairly generic job titles that don't go in and out of popularity, that will stay current for 5 to 10 years, because that's how long it takes to revise job titles. And I agree, sometimes they're not specific enough, sometimes they're too specific. But you're going to see with Haley, who's the next client that we work with, we're going to go to a composite code anyway. Once you have the composite code, you can take it into ONET and get as specific as you want to. Let's do probably just 2 or 3 more questions around this system and around Al, Karen, and then we're going to look at Haley, which is much more complicated.
Great. Okay. Let's see. I have another question from Kathleen. She's asking, is the combination Strong and MBTI report any better for older workers?
Better. Better is hard to define. With older workers especially, you really want to interpret the Strong and MBTI separately and verify the type and the general occupational themes before generating a report. I did use the combined report with the next client. You're going to see some pieces that I picked out of it. I find it very helpful, but again, I don't use the job titles as job titles. I use them to suggest other pieces that we're looking at in the career counseling process. You don't want the combined report to replace something. You want value added to what you're doing with the profile and the MBTI type.
Okay. Thank you. Another question is from Janine. So this is regarding Al's case study. So other than Al's business not doing well, were there other concerns in the 30 years that he had? I asked because being an ENFP in engineering could have caused some anxiety. And she asked, yes?
Yeah, and I think it did. He's a wonderful family man and a really nice guy, and I think he lived as ENFP in some activities in his community and his church, and he worked with an outdoor kids program during the summer and things like that. So he was definitely doing his ENFP thing. what I remember seeing, though, was when he saw the strong results, he was a little bit dejected. You know, it's okay, I've been there, I've done that. When we looked at the MBTI, which actually we had done first, his type was unclear, and it took a lot of discussion, as it also did with the next client. It took a lot of discussion for him to say, ENFP is who I really am. And I think he probably had some regrets, but you know, you become what you do. If you don't do who you are. Gosh, I made that up. I think it's sort of a half quote from the Tigers. And he was, when you get to be 50, 60, you're a combination of your genetic imprint and your life experience. And what he did with engineering, I think, was bring an ENFP contribution to the field of engineering. He was very entrepreneurial. He started his own company. He ran amazing he sponsored amazing training programs and professional development for his employees. He tried to integrate the ENFP stuff into his engineering. He just didn't know what it was.
And one more, I mean, we have several questions, but I have one more question from Kevin. He's asking, what was the values assessment that you use again?
Either a card sort. The one that I use is Dick Nodell's card sort. It's an old standby. The other one is the KVS, the Kerwin, Kerwin, the Kerwin Values Survey. If you Google it, you'll find it. It's not a CPP product, but it supports CPP products. It really backs up the MBTI. Let's take one more, Karen, and then, because I think when we talk about Haley, we're going to open the door for some more questions that are general.
Okay. Let's see. Here is another from, oh, this is a good question, from Barbara. She's asking, if you are working with someone with a disability who can no longer do what they love and their MBTI and strong point to careers they cannot do, how would you help them?
Oh, that would be a webinar, I think, in itself. That would be a whole webinar. It's all about transferable skills. And the model for rehabilitation counseling is that the first thing you do is generate all of the options, and then the physical disability is what sets the boundaries. So you get all the options out on the table first. You don't want to start with a disability. You start as if the disability were not there. And then the disability comes in to restrict the options. But that's that rehabilitation counseling, although I've taught in that field, is not my specialization, but it would be, that's an idea for a future webinar to address that whole topic, I think. We should probably, Karen, do you think go on with the next case?
Yes, I think so. Thank you.
Okay. With the person that I'm going to introduce you to, Haley, is very different from Al, and the approach that we took was very different. And the focus of the work with her was on the MBTI, and it wasn't on necessarily identifying best fit type. And I wanted to share this with you because I've had some personal experience with frustration. I'm kind of talking off the cuff here because I feel so strongly about this. I've experienced a lot of frustration with people who just can't verify best fit type. And it's frustrating for some practitioners. There's certain career professionals and practitioners with certain types who are really frustrated when they can't come up with the right answer with the client. But even more so, when a client takes an assessment, they expect to get an answer. And if we can't get an answer of a clear type from the MBTI, it kind of leaves things hanging. And so this is an approach that I've combined from several leaders in the field, several specialists in type dynamics, that really works. And Haley is probably one of the best examples. And she's typical of concerns that bring adults into career counseling. She's in her early 40s, and way back when she majored in English. And after college, she worked in editing for a few years and then completed a graduate program in social work. She's worked as a social worker for 12 years. And about a year ago, she just became mentally and physically exhausted. She fell apart. And she took a year's leave of absence from her social work job, and now that she's into her leave of absence, she's 6 or 7 months into it, she's not sure that she wants to go back. And while she's been on leave, she's done two things that she really, really loved. She took some graduate courses in psychology and counseling through her local university extension, and she had 2 bit parts in local community theater productions. When she first contacted me, she was actually a referral from a therapist, and when she first came to me, she was interested in exploring what her options might be if she doesn't return to social work. So on the surface, it pretty much looked like, okay, let's give her a strong and come up with options to social work for her code. And while Haley was taking classes at the university during her leave of absence, she decided to take some career assessments. She actually expected to come up with a list of occupations to explore. And on the MBTI, her reported type was INFJ. I actually have her profile here. And she mostly agreed with her highest themes on the strong. You can see the SA with the I following behind. She commented that although investigative, which is her 3rd theme on the strong, although she felt this reflected her recent curiosity about psychology, she didn't really agree with investigative descriptors for her own personality. She also had a few things to say about the very high social theme, saying that she had just about had enough of helping. That was what had totally exhausted her in the first place. Now, this is from the combined description for the social theme plus INFJ. These are called the imaginative helpers in the combined report. She pretty much agreed with the social plus INFJ description in the combined report, although once again she wasn't sure about the supportive and helpful work environment descriptors. Remember, she was really burned out. There are 2 pieces of this description that really stood out for her and that came up several times in the work that we did together. Enjoy imagining new possibilities for people. She felt that the focus in social work was more on the system than on the client, and she was very uncomfortable with this. And then finding innovative ways to solve people's problems. In her work setting, she frequently expressed ideas that she felt would be helpful to her clients and to the overall organization, but was told consistently, we can't do that here. Now, when she saw social work in her 10 top occupations on the strong and on her combined report, she was very upset. But that's what I've been doing. I remember her saying that, and it absolutely wore me out. And what that brought to mind for me was a contract I had many years ago with displaced school teachers. And I remember giving them the strong, and teaching came up on almost every one of them. And over and over and over again, I heard them say, but that's what I've been doing. That's what I've been doing. And we can't do that now. And so all of them, that was a disappointment in the strong. And it's one of the issues that we have to deal with when we use the strong in sometimes putting the job titles aside to address other pieces that might be more helpful. As career practitioners working with adults, there are 2 major considerations that may not be present for younger clients. And they may be, but it's definitely with adults. First of all, career is only one part of a much bigger life picture. And secondly, we can't assume that finding the right fit is why they're seeking career counseling or career coaching in the first place. In fact, it's more likely that we'll be focusing on the pieces that don't fit than on the pieces that do. And if they don't fit, what's behind it? I'm going to clear my throat and mute for just a second while you review these 7 steps that are involved in career counseling once again. I'm going to mute for just a second. Trust me, you didn't want me to cough in your ears. We're going to look again at the steps involved in career counseling and assessment with adult clients. This time we're going to take them one at a time and explore thoroughly how we approached each one. We'll take intake first. Now, you could pick up 6 different textbooks on career counseling. You could take a career development class from 6 different instructors, and you'd probably get 6 different models of how to do career counseling or career coaching. But what all of the models have in common is the importance of what I refer to as intake, the first meeting with the client. This actually comes from a social work model. Intake is about listening. For the practitioner, it means putting all of our J tendencies aside, J from the MBTI, because with adults there's just no set plan that applies to everybody. We're listening for hypotheses, what might be going on, how might we address it together. And there are several things you want to listen for. First of all, you want to listen for their type. Try to frame hypotheses about their type, at least the function that they extrovert, so that you can frame your language and style to fit theirs. You want to listen for career messages. These are often what's between the lines, messages about work, from significant others in their lives, even from family history. Listen for their beliefs about their own self-efficacy, their ability, their obstacles to success. Listen very closely to their expectations, what they expect to have at the end of the process with you. And listen for their commitment. Are they committed to the career development process? Most importantly, try to pick up discrepancies between why they say they're there and your hypotheses about what's really going on. It's your hypothesis about what is going on within the parameters of your skill set and qualifications. Is your hypothesis something that you can deal with, or possibly is a referral going to be necessary? You know, we all know that career counseling doesn't put other issues on the back burner. That's one of the important things about contracting, is that in the career counseling relationship we're dealing with very specific things. But if you have a hypothesis from what you've heard that there's something that's going to get in the way of any productive work together, then you may have to negotiate another service that will be more helpful for the client. With adult clients specifically, this intake process will often be the longest of all of your meetings. And if you and your client don't agree on where you're going together, you're never going to get there. So you have to invest that time, and so does your client, in sharing as much information as possible. And actually, I've always made it a practice. I don't do private work too much anymore, but when I did, I required an extensive written vocational history prior to the first session with adults, and it included a vocational family tree that goes back at least to parents and grandparents, more generations if we could. And the history will provide huge clues to messages, beliefs, expectations, and to commitment. And if they're not willing to take the time to do this, then they're not going to be committed to the work that serious career development requires. Okay, we're going to look at contracting now. This is step 2. Contracting between the practitioner and the client needs to happen at the end of the first meeting, certainly. And it can either be formal or informal, but it works best when something is written down and signed. And there's several reasons for this critical piece. It clarifies expectations, and it puts out on the table that your role is to provide a framework for them to do the work. Your role is not to do the work for them. And contracting sets boundaries around the process and clearly differentiates between career counseling and coaching and other issues. Particularly during challenging economic times, colleges and universities don't have the staff for extended counselor-student relationships, and clients don't have the resources to pay for 25 sessions with a private career professional. So if you contract at the beginning, it gives you a gentle fallback when discussions veer off track, and they will. This is particularly important with NP clients, clients who have N and P in their MBTI type. And I have a script that I use that goes something like this. I'll try to do it when they bring something up that's unrelated. I'll say something like, we can certainly discuss that, But keep in mind that we only agreed to 4 sessions. And if we go there, we'll need to adjust our agreement. And I'll have to let you set the priorities. Which is more important to you now, to begin your job search or to talk about what happened yesterday with your daughter? See, the gentle fallback there is we agreed on something and now you're going in a different direction, so we're going to have to revisit that agreement a little bit. Contracting involves the client in deciding what you're going to do together and how. And this certainly relates back to the question about when do you use the strong, when do you not use the strong, because when you're talking about what the client is working with you to deal with, that goes into the contract. We're going to do an interest inventory, we're going to do a personality assessment, or we're not. And these are the implications for doing them and the implications for not doing them. The more engaged the clients are in every step of the process, the more likely it is that they'll reach positive outcomes at the end. That's why involving the client in this contracting and in the agreement really makes a difference. But the contract also serves as a checklist. I actually have a little chart format that I kind of scratch out while we're talking. I don't have a chart in a notebook, but it's a piece of paper with a checklist, and I actually fill it in by hand as we're talking. It includes what we're going to do in each session and what each of us will do in between. And when it's done, it's checked off. And when I was in private practice, I made casual notes while the client was with me, and then I signed it and they signed it and we both agreed on it, and then I would send them an email that summarized it and usually reminded them of any work that they were going to be doing in between sessions. I think we've alluded to this. This is step 3 about assessment, and testing is not always a part of career counseling with adults. It certainly can be, and I tend to rely on the MBTI, but I'm a firm believer that less is more, which is why I'm particularly partial to the Strong and MBTI assessments, because we can get everything from these 2 assessments except for ability. And ability can be established with adults from prior testing records or self-report or school records or almost anything. Adult clients know what they're good at. We just have to ask the right questions, and the Strong and the MBTI provide the triggers for those questions. Now, more often than not, and since this webinar is about the Strong and the MBTI assessments, I'll contract with clients for MBTI assessment or Strong assessment or both. And just a note here about type and interests. MBTI retesting is not really necessary or even recommended if type has been previously verified, and many adult clients will come to you knowing their type. There's no reason to reassess. The genetic imprint of type does not change, and previous knowledge of type leads right into a discussion of type development. Now, if they don't remember their type, or they don't agree with their type, or they don't have any type vocabulary to deal with, then of course you have to assess so that you can bring all of that to the surface. But if they come in talking about a type, then go with what they know. Now, strong retesting is usually recommended if more than 6 months have passed since previous testing, or if clients have experienced any major life changes. Interests change. The general occupational themes might not, but basic interests and occupational similarity might come up differently. I very quickly brushed on the Strong and MBTI comparison when we were talking about Al, but I wanted to put it in more solid form here. We usually don't talk diagnostically in career counseling, but using the Strong and MBTI together can very often cut to the chase in a hurry. And remember, we don't have 25 sessions, so the quicker we can get to the real issue, the better. Remember that the MBTI profiles inborn preferences. It's what we refer to as genetic imprints. The Strong profiles socialized interests, what we've been exposed to. The MBTI is essentially who we were meant to be if we can verify a type, and the Strong is essentially what we've been allowed to become. If interests haven't developed in a direction suggested by the heart of type, the middle 2 letters, then the career development issue is right there in front of you. Does the client need to revisit their initial educational and career choices? Do they need to restructure their work to incorporate more of their actual verified type? Or do they need to shift to a work environment that's more authentic for them? Our core personality is represented by the MBTI heart of type. That's that who piece that we looked at with Al. It's the perceiving and judging cognitive processes that we prefer. Those are the middle two letters of type. The reassect themes suggest work environments that our socialized personality is attracted to. The farther away the work environment is from a person's core personality, the more tweaking we're going to be faced with, either modifying the person or modifying the environment. And I'm going to show you this a little bit with Al. Here we're looking at the who and the where pieces. Al, remember, was an ENFP, and he had worked most of his life in a realistic work environment, which is primarily ST. It took a lot of tweaking to move him closer to his type. Haley's a little bit different. Adult clients rarely jump from one corner of the hexagon to another as Al did. They may say that they want to do something completely different, but it's more likely that they'll tweak the corner that they're in or incorporate one of the adjoining corners. The teacher, for instance, who says, I never want to go into another classroom as long as I live, I hate teaching, is probably looking at changing his or her teaching environment or moving into some other area that has a social theme. What Haley did is probably more common than what Al did. Haley didn't jump across the hexagon, but the counseling process with her was a little bit more complicated. As we said before, Haley had taken the MBTI previously, and the fourth step in career counseling with adults is verifying type. And she had never done that. And so during the intake, I could certainly hear her extroverted feeling, suggesting an FJ type. And she took more than a second or two to respond to my questions. So I was pretty sure that I was hearing introversion, feeling, and judging. But she said that some things that just aren't usually associated with INFJ types. So I decided to discuss the functions with her in both the extroverted and introverted orientations to see if I was hearing her true type or something else. Linda Behrens, who is one of the type experts that I refer to often, makes a very important distinction, and it's particularly true of adult types. There's a true type or a core type, and then there's developed type, and then there's current behavior or contextual type. And with adult clients, this distinction is basic to career counseling and coaching. How people come out on the indicator is always treated as a hypothesis to be verified. And core type is where it all starts. That's the identity, the sense of a sense of who the person really is. Type development is part of the integration of the personality. It's often where adult clients are. And then contextual type is often what we're dealing with in work adjustment coaching, teaching clients behaviors that are appropriate for different situations. We're also doing this a lot with the current economy. Key is figuring out what Haley was expressing when she answered the questions on the day that she took the assessment. I'm going to do a little bit of a vocabulary review because we're going to discuss MBTI functions very differently. We're going to be talking about type dynamics. Now, first of all, the orientations on the MBTI are EI and JP. The functions, or the cognitive processes, or the mental functions, whatever you're calling them, are sensing, intuition, SN, and TF. The perceiving functions, the P part of everyone's personality, is S and N, sensing and intuition. And the judging functions, the J part of the personality, is T or F. We all use all four functions, SN and TF, in both the extroverted and introverted orientations. So an ENFJ type might naturally extrovert their feeling judgment. An INFP type might naturally introvert their feeling judgment. The core, or the heart of type, refers to the middle two letters. The middle two letters are the function pairs. They are the type table columns if you're used to working with a type table. Now, Haley and I talked briefly, excuse me just a second. Haley and I talked briefly about the 4 function pairs. I usually call them the hearts of type and how she saw herself. And I wanted to verify that with her first before exploring type development and type in context. And this was Haley's very first light bulb. She immediately saw the difference between her NF need to empower and what she had been doing as a social worker, which was providing practical service to others. What had confused her were the generic descriptions of the feeling function coupled with her very high score on the social theme on the strong. She'd been beating herself up because there was all this feeling stuff going on with her. She wanted to help others, and wasn't that what social workers did? And that's where type development comes in. Using type with adult clients tends to be much more about how they use the 4 mental processes or functions than it is about getting their type right. And this kind of an interpretation allows us to talk about core, developed, and contextual type without the pressure that clients sometimes feel around choosing one 4-letter type over another. When providing this information and listening to clients, you always want to have a hypothesis forming and reforming in your head. And if you prefer intuition, you're going to be looking for patterns. And if you prefer sensing, you're looking for data. But this framework for discussing type requires that you use some of each. We begin by explaining that the MBTI looks at how we like to perceive things and how we like to evaluate what we perceive. And there are 4 ways of perceiving and 4 ways of making decisions about what we perceive. Everyone does all of them at different times. Sensing, directed either inward or outward. Intuition, directed either inward or outward. Judgment, deciding, directed either inward or outward. Thinking, and feeling, directed either inward or outward. I'm sorry, my bullets didn't follow my speech. I got a little off track. I'm going to show you how we went about this, and I'll use a couple of examples to see how it feels for you. With Haley, we already had a hypothesis from her reported type. So we started by talking about intuition, how we like to perceive. Remember, she had taken the MBTI and perceived did show up on her actual report. Now, Haley talked about how in her work environment as a social worker, her mind was constantly racing to generate possibilities for people, how her clients often saw her as particularly insightful from her ability to pick up on what wasn't said even more than what was said. I think you can probably see that in the introverted intuition column. She didn't see herself as particularly enthusiastic and expressed being exhausted by people who were constantly going in different directions with ideas. She said that she liked to brainstorm in her own head, but wanted focus when talking with others. A particularly telling statement was that people often said things to her like, where did that come from? She chose between these 2, introverted and intuition, as her favorite. Remember, we're just looking at these 2. Now, we also looked at sensing. Sensing is not in her reported type, but she uses it. Haley didn't really have much to say about the sensing function. She shuddered over having to remember details and doing things the way they've always been done. And she stressed that in social work you have to pay attention to the reality of what's going on. It's always the reality, noticing exactly what people are saying and doing. She said that it was much easier for her to imagine possibilities than it was for her to be practical. And of these 2, she said, it's certainly not what I like. But of the 2, probably extroverted sensing more than introverted sensing. Now, in my brain, I was thinking this is developed. She developed it to go with the requirements of her job. Then we moved to judging, and we talked about the feeling function, expressed differently when it's extroverted than it is when it's introverted. The feeling function was hard for Haley to talk about. She saw herself in both, but the descriptor that made the decision for her was meeting others' needs before your own. You see that under extroverted feeling. No question, she said, that's my downfall. And she chose extroverted feeling as her preference. We also talked about thinking. We know that we use all 4 functions. And Haley very much identified with being self-critical. and described several situations where she had to analyze information objectively and use logic. She was very clear that she could override her empathy for individuals with logic when it meant getting something for them that she felt they needed. She also described projects that she'd been in charge of and said that she hadn't particularly liked putting people's feelings aside to get something done, but that she'd done it when necessary. She tends to be the one who asks a lot of questions. Her husband calls her a whiny, W-H whiny. She said that she really couldn't choose between these two. Neither was really her preference, but she was really working to develop both. What she did, and remember this is the working hypotheses that we have, but Haley ordered her function preferences this way. Her very favorite function was introverted intuition. INFJ, remember, that's dominant for INFJ. Her next favorite function is extroverted feeling, and then thinking, maybe introverted, she's not always sure, and very lastly to extroverted sensing. In fact, when we were talking about sensing, it came out that when she was working and under a lot of stress, she'd come home at night, eat ice cream, and watch TV reruns for hours. These are typical behaviors of inferior extroverted sensing, her fourth favorite. Although these seem to be her core preferences, it was evident that she also used the functions in their opposite orientations, as we all do. It wasn't unusual for her to lead brainstorming sessions and staff meetings and to become very enthusiastic with certain clients, which has developed extroverted N. She was also very much in touch with her personal values and talked about being authentic as a primary motivator, and that's what's behind her current work in career development. She didn't have much use for sensing in either orientation, although she recognized right away that she sometimes had to pay attention to it. Now, we're going to pause in a minute because this is a little bit complicated, but I want to review the hypotheses that we're forming as she was talking and as we were verifying type. This is Haley's whole type. And we'll pause for a minute after the next slide. If you interpret type this way, instead of taking the dichotomies one at a time in order, several things happen. Adult clients can relate somewhat to all 8 function orientations, and that's a good thing. There isn't any pressure to get it right. The whole type emerges with very little further discussion, and you're able to identify why there was dissatisfaction with past jobs, what clients want now, and why. Now, applying the rules that you see up here, we know that if introverted intuition is her favorite function, then her whole type is introverted and judging, INJ. If she clearly identifies with extroverted feeling, the whole type is most likely INFJ, which is how she reported. That would make thinking less preferred, her tertiary function, and her experience with sensing certainly supported it being her very least preferred function mental process. Now, with this kind of type discussion behind us, the rest of the picture falls into place. This is the hypothesis that I'm forming. In social work, she was overutilizing her auxiliary extroverted feeling and inferior sensing at the expense of dominant intuition. And using resources available to her in the system to help clients, she was unable to be creative. She had to stay within these very rigid boundaries. And inferior sensing eventually got the best of her, and she became exhausted enough to need a leave of absence. So somehow we have to turn this around, which is where the strong comes in. And we're going to use it to describe some more satisfying work environments in a minute. Let's pause. I know this is challenging to grasp, and what I wanted to do was to give you kind of a big picture overview of it, and then I'll give you some resources to follow up if you want to learn more about this approach. Karen, have you been able to distill a few questions, or are people muddling?
I do have a few questions. Okay, so the first one is from Catherine. She asks, has it been your experience that clients who have had significant life changes may say that they were once like one MBTI type but are now like another?
Of course.
I specifically noticed clients mentioning the EI dimension.
Yes,
they were more E before the event and more I afterwards.
Yes. No, definitely, and that's why you want to listen and generate hypotheses about what's the core type, what's the developed type, and what is the contextual type. And EI never develops on its own. It does not. EI is an orientation. It's not a mental process. It's not something that's developed. What happens is the middle two letters of type develop and integrate, and as that goes on, EI will often shift. But it doesn't. The core personality doesn't shift. What shifts is how they're answering the questions, and our job is to get at what's behind how they're answering the questions.
Okay, another question is from Ginny. Ginny asks, NS can equate to A in reassess. I use that as creative. Haley seemed to be responding to that creative part of herself. Her S and A scores were not that far apart. Did you point this out?
Yes, and that's coming. She did. She verified A in the first position. Good for you.
Another comes from Bill. Bill says, I really like using these function descriptors in introverted and extroverted orientation. I have not seen these before. Are they part of the MBTI report? If not, from where did you distill these lists?
I'm going to give you the publications at the end. This is the approach to interpreting type that's covered in certification programs that focus on type dynamics. The best resource is Introduction to Type Dynamics and Development. There are also a couple of authors. Linda Behrens is wonderful with this material. Cynthia Stengel-Paris is another one. I'm glad you picked this up because it's critical. The generic words and phrases that are used to describe S, N, T, and F, people will only identify with half because they're generic. They're covering both E and I orientations. And I agree. This is really important stuff. And it's too complicated for any teen-year-old unless you're doing serious career counseling and can form your own hypotheses. But with an adult, I worked with Haley for 7 or 8 sessions, and it was life-changing for her. And it wasn't based on job titles and career fields.
Okay, another question is from Joe. Joe asks, have you used MBTI Step 2, and if so, have you found it helpful as a quicker way to verify type and find career choice fit?
I use the Step 2. I don't think it's quicker, but what I've been focusing on here is that the point is not necessarily to verify type, although we did that with Haley. The point with adults is to help them to sort out how they want to use the 4 functions, S, N, and TF, in both EI and in both E and I orientations. So verifying the type does not become the critical point. But yeah, I like Step 2, and very often it will explain the difference between the generic descriptions of the functions and what the person is describing about themselves.
Okay. Another is from Valerie. Valerie asked, she was saying, excellent steps. However, any tips for those of us restricted to 30-minute appointments on a short-term basis? And she notes that they do set aside an hour-and-a-half workshop for Strong inventory or MBTI interpretation.
Mm-hmm. It's the premise behind this is that if you're doing serious career development work with adults, it's not a 30-minute process. I can't do it. All you can do in short 30-minute sessions is test and tell people their results. And I know that, and I know the restrictions of our work settings, and I think it's up to us as practitioners to change the system. And I've been in the system for 45 years. I'm still working at changing it. But that's why I'm at a time in my life where most of my career counseling is now pro bono, because I felt like the 30 years that I spent in private practice, I could only really work with people who could afford it. And so now that I'm at this stage in my life, actually in Al's stage, I do this kind of work in my community, and I'm working with people who are unemployed, and it's just a wonderful awareness for them to have the opportunity to really look at how they want to express themselves on the job. And 30 minutes, we just can't go there. We can do a lot of good in 30 minutes. We just can't do this. And Karen, let's do 2 more, and then I want to show you where we wound up with Haley.
Okay, great. Okay, so I have another one here from Lisa. how do you work with someone who has been laid off from their job as a nurse and she loved what she did? She's in her late 50s and still wants to do this work, but is having a hard time finding another job in her field. She came to see me for career counseling, trying to figure out what else she could do.
It sounds like she knows who she is and what she wants, so it becomes a career search, job search. We did a webinar on that on this last year. It's not as much about finding a job as it is reading the interview process and adapting to the interview process to make yourself marketable. I mean, you know as well as I do, there are many, many, many opportunities for nursing that are not in traditional nursing environments, and so it becomes our job to open up all the possibilities and teach them how to go after them, which is not the focus of what we're talking about today, unfortunately. The Strong can help with that, by the way. The Strong will come up with lots of, the Strong taken to ONET will certainly come up with related occupations.
Okay, so the last question, yes, thank you.
The
last question is from Sarah. She's asking, you say things like genetic imprint or who we were meant to be. Is there research or data to support this? A lot of my clients ask for proof and are highly educated. I would appreciate any research or data you may have.
Yeah, certainly all of the research on type and brain functioning supports the genetic imprint. The best place to start is with the archive, the research archives that are at CAPT, CAPT.org. If you go to that website and click on research, it will take you to it, and just look up brain functioning or MBTI and brain activity or genetics, and it will come. I mean, we even have the twin studies. Everything supports it. But remember that slide. I know I've thrown a lot at you. I've done an NT thing today, and I'm feeling a little bit worried about that. Remember that slide where we talked about core type and developed type and contextual type. So we all have different ways of behaving, and the core type is who we are at our core. And there are many ways of getting at that. I was working last week with a group that's faith-based, and they don't use the MBTI. They use faith-based assessments to get at that core self. It's who you were meant to be. Developed is when the other side of your type, if you're an NF, it's when the ST begins to integrate and you develop functions. And then contextual type is behaving appropriately in a situation. And what I'm always worried about is that when people are taking the MBTI, they're taking it in context. So we have to really sort out whether we're getting contextual type or we're getting that true self. And that's why it's a little bit more than 20 minutes. I hope I've addressed that enough, because what I want to do is show you Haley Strong and where we went. And I think I can wrap this up in just a few minutes.
Great.
Is that okay, Karen?
Yeah, no, that sounds good. I also wanted to mention, Sarah, that we have some excellent resources and research that you can find in our MBTI manual as well as the Strong manual.
Oh, good point, Karen. I always forget the manual. It's like a basic resource. Okay.
Those are my go-tos. So.
Very good. Well, it should be. It should be. I just wanted to point out, and the question came up, that we revisited Haley's Strong results after we had verified her type. And remember that she pretty much agreed with her social and artistic general occupational themes. Reconsidering them after discussing her type, she was inclined to put artistic before social. And actually, the basic interest areas do support both. These were all very high areas for her. And if these are her 10 top occupations, do you see the A showing up? And actually, we computed a composite code for her, and A came out a little bit more clear than social. Artistic came up a little bit more clear than social for her. Here are the full occupational lists for social and artistic. You can see a lot of ink under both. But we've got that artistic is actually a stronger occupational code. This is similarity with workers. This is picking up on her NF. And the person who asked the question was absolutely right that NF correlates with artistic. Now the F also correlates with social, but NF correlates with that artistic social piece, whereas SF is more the pure social. Her third letter was investigative. I guess it's pretty clear there. In fact, the only occupation that's even worth talking about under investigative is psychologist. Now, 2 of Haley's personal style scales gave us some real important information, and personal styles are wonderful for verifying the general occupational themes on the strong. Her work style scale is very far to the right, which doesn't usually fit with the introverted MBTI orientation. This is very often a central issue with introverted types that extrovert feeling. So those would be ISFJ and INFJ, because these types are energized by solitude and reflection, and yet they're driven to help others. And when there isn't enough downtime during a day of helping, their auxiliary feeling function can pretty much drain them of energy. And this was actually Haley's main complaint. And also notice that her risk-taking score is way to the left, and that means that she's going to approach this transition with caution. So brainstorming a lot of options, we don't want to completely overwhelm her. Here's her combined report. I showed you this earlier. We had initially scored it combining INFJ with social, and then we rescored it putting artistic first, the imaginative helpers versus the imaginative creators. And she's still identified with most of the social and INFJ descriptors, especially those unique to INFJs at work. But the artistic work environment strongly resonated with her. And she combined these 2 descriptions to describe her ideal work environment. She knew that she wanted one that was collaborative, supportive, helpful, and focused on benefiting others, but that was unstructured, flexible, and autonomous. There were 3 task statements that particularly stood out for her from the combined report: finding innovative ways to solve people's problems, encouraging personal and professional development, and developing action plans to actualize their ideals. Now, based on Haley's integrated MBTI and her strong results, she focused her exploration on 5 career options: counseling psychologist, remember she's a social worker, licensed clinical social worker, she's not a licensed clinician, family therapist, school counselor, and psychodramatist. And she agreed to do some preliminary research on ONET and to investigate state licensing agreements before our last appointment. Now, step 7 is actually developing a plan of action and following up, and it's often the step that falls by the wayside in career counseling, certainly on college campuses where we don't have a lot of time with our students. And it's important in any work setting and any age group that the initial contract is reviewed and that the professional follows up with clients to help them with stumbling blocks, because they're going to run into some. Sometimes just an email is all that's needed. And in the 2 weeks following our last session, Haley researched the occupations that interested her, and she eliminated school counselor right away. Too much sensing, she said. And she investigated counseling psychology PhD programs at 3 different universities. She found out the requirements for clinical licensing and social work in her state, and she actually sat in on a psychodrama class at her local university. And she developed a plan. And the plan started with completing the 2 classes she was missing for her clinical social work licensing and documenting required supervised hours from her employment. And she could complete both of these within the next few months, about the time that she was supposed to return to work from her leave of absence. And we would further work together to explore job settings that would be a better fit for her given what she knew about herself and assuming that she had met licensing requirements. And she felt that this was a really safe step on the way that she was to what she was now seriously considering, which was a PhD in counseling psych, perhaps even with a concentration in psychodrama. And incidentally, for all of you NFs out there who are wondering about her theater experience, she's auditioning for community theater, not necessarily a career interest, but something that she wants to make room for in her life. I know we just walked through how the MBTI and Strong assessments can be used with 2 very different kinds of clients. And I'm aware that looking at type this way is not the norm. But it doesn't mean that we can't all take pieces of it and use them. And it's part of extensive training on the MBTI and also on the Strong, learning how to break down the pieces of the Strong. And if you'd like to learn more about the assessments themselves, I wanted to make sure that you knew about the certification providers for well, both the MBTI and the Strong. You can become certified for the MBTI through CPP, the publisher, who's hosting this webinar for us, of course, the American Management Association, the Center for Applications of Psychological Type, and then GS Consultants is my company, and we actually have an online program specifically for educators and career counselors that focuses on type dynamics. And GS is also the provider of Strong certification. We do it online, and if I can convince any of you to come to Lake Tahoe, by all means, we do it every June. This year it's June 11th to the 14th. These are the references that I've been using through this webinar today. I wrote a booklet that combines the Strong and the MBTI called Career Exploration for College Students, and this uses the 4 W's. It uses a lot of this process. Introduction to Type Dynamics and Development is the key booklet that outlines the introverted and extroverted expressions of the functions. I like Donna Dunning's Introduction to Type and Communication, which also focuses on this. And Jane Keish and Sandra Hurst also did Introduction to Type and Coaching, which looks at the functions and the different orientations as well. Introduction to Type and the 8 Jungian functions, it's probably the deepest of the Introduction to Type booklets, and a lot of the specifics that I pulled out are from Hartzler and McAlpine's work. Carolyn Zeisek wrote The Art of Dialogue, which talks about a lot of this, and also a wonderful handout that capped cells called Type Dynamics, another level of type, can be helpful. That's Jean Kumaro's handout. Jean, I know she doesn't mind my sharing it with you. Jean is a sensing type, and she writes about this material very, very clearly. Now, CPP has made it possible for you to get some of these resources at a discount, and there's a promotion code you want to use. It's EXPERT911. I love that code, Karen. EXPERT911. That's going to be good till October 7th. It will give you 10% off your purchases. You can't use it. Don't use it on Skills 1. And this is not for international orders. This is specifically for orders directly from CPP. You can also try out the assessments if you haven't taken them and you wonder what we're talking about. CPP.com/test drive is where you can take the assessments and get your results from one of CPP's representatives. And I've also included the GS blog where we talk about challenging profiles and challenging cases. And if you're an international customer, here's the link for information on products and services at cpp.com/global sales. Jim and Jack aren't with us today. Many of you work with Jim and Jack. They work with our educational clients. And I think, Karen, I'm not sure I timed this well because we're bringing this right to the end. And I wondered if, do you have some concluding comments, or were there a couple of, we have room for maybe 2 quick questions.
Sure, I can ask you a couple questions. Let's see. I'll try to be quick. So we have Rachel that asks, how do you prep someone for the MBTI so they answer to their core type and not contextual type?
It's hard. And that's why using this approach with adults, it can really work because you can sort that out. Of course, you never want to say answer according to the way you are at work or anything like that. It's answer the first response that comes most comfortably to you, the most naturally to you, the first thing that comes to mind, how you're most comfortable, and assure them that if they answer the way they really feel they are, they really truly are, and they want to do things differently, we can help them do that. But if they're not answering naturally, we don't know what we've got. So it's just reassuring them that the results are confidential, that type is not going to limit them to one thing over another, that the more natural the responses, the more comfortable their responses, the more that we'll have to work with. And by the way, there's a phrase in the manual that we've gotten away from that's shoes off self. That's got cultural implications to it, so we tend to move away from that statement now.
Thank you. Okay, so I'll ask the last question from Gary. Gary says, Haley seems well-equipped to work with MBTI and apply the vocabulary to her situation. Do you find most clients need a lot more help applying the concepts to issues like career match, etc.?
Gary, most of what I had on the slides is my language. That's how I was forming the hypothesis about what was going on with Haley. I had some checklists for her. And when I was working with her, I didn't say, now we're looking for an environment where you can extrovert your feeling, or where you can introvert your feeling, or use more of your introverted intuition. The vocabulary was really a review for us. With her, I'm talking English, which is, it's pretty clear that in social work you're falling back way more than your type likes to on factual, printed information and policies and procedures and things, and you want more creativity in your work. So she didn't have to become completely conversant in type vocabulary, although that's where she's going, because she's going to be she loves type. But I think if you're working with checklists and the reports and things, you've got the vocabulary that they can relate to. Are we going to wrap it here, Karen?
Yeah, I think so, actually.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
I think we pulled it pretty close to the deadline today, and I try not to do that. It's my NT got really excited about this topic, I'm afraid.
Great. Okay, well, unfortunately, we have run out of time, everyone, but I'd like to thank you all for taking time out of your busy day to attend and for asking so many excellent questions.
They were great questions.
Yeah, they were, and we had a lot of them. Also, I'd like to thank you, Judy, for sharing your knowledge and expertise with us today. So thank you so much. And well, today's webinar is part of an ongoing series featuring Judy as our expert. Our next webinar is scheduled for October 20th, and we'll be covering the topic, Exploring Careers Using the Strong and MBTI Assessment. You can register by visiting our website at tpp.com/askanexpert. We hope you'll be able to join us in October. And thank you all for attending today, and have a wonderful day.
Thanks, Karen.
Thank you. Bye-bye.